Hi there. Welcome to those of you joining us online. I'll give it just a few seconds while we have others pop on, and then I'll get started with some announcements for us. All right, I think I'll kick us off. So, greetings to those of you that are here with us. My name is Lauren Moberg. I'm currently the Interim Executive Director here at MACMA and excited to have you all with us. You are at the workshop Betting on Trouble, the Rise of Online Gambling in Teenagers with Thad Shunkwiler, one of our board members. I'm just going to share a few little announcements before we get started, and then I'll hand it over to Thad. Um, so you are on the Zoom webinar platform, so your camera is not showing. But you do have the ability to chat in. You'll just want to make sure that if you're chatting that you select everyone in the chat so that actually, I think that will work, that all folks can see your chats. Otherwise, we think there is potentially an ability to use the Q&A function as well. So if you click there and want to ask a question, we should be able to allow you to speak for a second if you wanted to make a comment that way. Also, so you know, this workshop is being recorded, so if you are chatting at all, just keep that in mind and de-identify any individuals if we're discussing anything that would be related to cases. If you want to enable closed captioning, you just click on the closed caption button in your meeting controls. And just wanted to let everyone know that we do have board applications for CEUs for this training that are currently in process. So we'll be sending out CEUs as soon as we get those approvals. And we do anticipate those approvals, but they are not with us today. So we'll be sending those out to everyone who attended after the fact. So with that, I will hand it over to Thad.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for getting us kicked off and get it started. It's the first one of 2026 for the MACMA training series. I'm honored to be with you all here today. For those joining live on today's webinar, and for those who will be watching later this year, a special welcome to you as well. I'm really excited to kick off today's training, Betting on Trouble: The Rise of Online Gambling in Teenagers. And so, as Lauren pointed out, this is a webinar feature, so that's not quite the same as, more of that classroom style Zoom, but I do welcome questions in the Q&A, and if you're able to dump them in the chat. I wasn't quite sure if the participants could use chat or not, but I'm hoping to make this as interactive as possible. That's always the goal when we're doing online trainings like this. But so yeah, I think we'll just go ahead and get started here. Give me 1 second, get my screen going. Okay, so here it is, the topic of the day. And so just a quick, brief introduction of who I am for those who I haven't yet had the opportunity to be with. And so I'm Thad Shunkwiler. I'm an associate professor down at the Minnesota State University, Mankato. Go Mavericks in the Department of Health Science. I've actually been at MSU now. This would be my 11th year, and I say it would be my 11th year because I'm currently on sabbatical. I took the whole academic 2025-26 academic year off to be on sabbatical, which has allowed me to do more of this, to go out and share my passion, things I've learned over the years, and this topic being one of them. Another thing that I'm doing while on sabbatical is I'm working clinically. And so I am the founder and lone therapist at Mankato Marriage Solutions, a small clinic here in Mankato that specializes and focuses in on high conflict couples and family challenges. And so part of my reasoning for that was when I was in school, one of the things I liked least were the faculty who taught something they hadn't done for many, many years, and in some instances never had done it. And so I didn't want to become that faculty member. And so while on sabbatical, I said, I want to do some clinical work, and what I learn in that I can bring back in to the classroom. And so that's That's what I'm currently up to. Just a couple of other quick tidbits about me. I am the current vice chair of the Minnesota Board of Marriage and Family Therapy, and so it's a privilege to serve my fellow MFTs in the regulatory capacity. And then, as Lauren mentioned, I have the utmost privilege to be part of the board of directors for MACMA, the Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health, and have been now. I think this will be my fourth year on the board of directors, and it's quite a privilege. Um, there's a whole backstory about me. I failed out of school, went to jail, joined the army, all that stuff. We don't have time to get into it, but if you're all interested in kind of a comeback story, I had the opportunity to do a TED Talk a few years ago that outlined how I went from failing out of school to the military to becoming a healthcare provider. And so I'd encourage you to check that out. And then most importantly, the only reason I'm here and do this is my family. My wife, Lisa, is an attorney here in Mankato. And then we have three beautiful boys. Owen, who is an eighth grader now, can't believe it. And then we have 5-year-old twins who are in kindergarten. So if you see any like rings below my eyes, it's quite a bit. So yeah, I guess that's me. And maybe another part about me that might be helpful is why this topic? Like, why did I choose to kind of spend this afternoon talking about online sports gambling? Of all the things that we could talk about and come to learn, why that? And part of it is my research examines how changes in policy impact behavioral health outcomes. And what I mean by policy is that when we change laws, what happens down the road, right? So a big part of my work over the past decade, I suppose, has been on cannabis. And many of you, if you've ever seen me before, it's likely you probably saw me talking about cannabis and the legalization of marijuana and its impact. And this is in a very similar vein that we are exploring legalizing sports betting, much like our friends to the south in Iowa have, and multiple other places will come to learn across this country. And so part of that has me looking at when we do that and when states have gone that way, what has been the impact on its community? And particularly, because I have a special place in my heart for children's mental health, what has been the impact on children? And so today, as we'll take a peek at here, um, that's what we're going to focus on is this whole rise, like what's happening nationally, and as much as we can, looking at what's happened locally with teenagers and online sports betting. And we'll also dabble outside of sports betting because that isn't the only thing, as we'll come to learn today, that young people are wagering and gambling on as the outcome of sporting events. But we only have 2 hours together. This is a topic that I could probably spend a whole day on and get into the nuts and bolts of it. But ultimately, you're getting an overview, and you can see here in this training outline kind of where we plan to go over the next few hours. But I also like to kind of lead off with what the outcome is. That if you think about after these 2 hours, whether you're here live or you're joining us on the recording later, what can you expect to leave this webinar with? And none of you are going to leave experts in adolescent gambling, right? That's not the idea of any 2 hour webinar is to make you an expert in anything, but ultimately, my goal is to bring attention to an issue that I don't think gets a whole lot of attention. And in fact, I've seen that as I've done this topic and this presentation, not only across Minnesota, but across the Midwest and even the country. People were like, I didn't know this was an issue. I had no idea it was as big a problem as it was. And so I'm trying to correct that. I'm trying to, whenever I can, get the opportunity to share what I've learned to enhance your knowledge as the clinicians out there doing the work, as the professionals interacting with families and young people, and even as parents, if we have any other parents on the call today, to introduce this topic to you because it's likely already impacted your home in some way. So ultimately, at the end of these 2 hours, you should have an increased understanding or an enhanced knowledge of this issue, how we got here and where we're likely to go. Following the data. So yeah, that's kind of where we're headed. You can see there that I have Uncle Sam saying, I want you to participate. It is one of those webinars where it makes it a little harder, but I do welcome questions into the Q&A and into the chat if you're able. If you're not able to put it in the chat, put whatever comment you have in the Q&A, and I will periodically take a peek at the Q&A and see if anybody has anything. And then we'll save some time at the end for any kind of questions that you have. And then at the end, I also share my email. So even if you don't want to engage in the live training, I welcome emails to ask any questions or any follow-ups. I also don't mind sharing this slideshow with you. There's nothing proprietary in here. It's just publicly available content that I have packaged in a way to help you develop a better understanding. So if you want this presentation, whether you're live today or watching it later this year, just at the end, you'll see a slide that has my email address. I'm not hard to find. Just send me an email and I'd be happy to share today's slideshow with you if that is at all helpful. So, I like to start with why. Like, why does this matter? I've found in being an educator for the past, full time the past decade, but have been involved in teaching higher ed now for about 15 years. One of the things that I have learned, and the pedagogical research would support, is that if you convince somebody that something is important, the why, they are much more likely to pay attention to it. And so if you've done trainings with me in the past, I always start with why this topic matters. And I like to showcase why it matters just using some recent news stories, the media conversations around this issue. And so you can see there right at the top from CBS News that we will be once again discussing legalizing sports betting here in Minnesota. It has been a topic of conversation for close to a decade as 2018, so not quite a decade. For about 8 years, we've been having this conversation in Minnesota about legalizing sports betting. And I'll take this opportunity to say now that I don't professionally have an opinion one way or the other about whether we should legalize sports betting or not. I'm not anti-sports betting. I'm not pro-sports betting, but I am pro-science. I am pro learning what has happened in other places and preparing for those negative outcomes to the best that we can. And so if our elective representatives decide that it is now time to join the other 38 states in this country who have legalized online sports betting, then okay, that's what they're elected to do. And if we never do it, okay too. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not here advocating one side of this conversation or the other, but it is a conversation that has been ongoing and over the last couple of sessions has really geared up a lot of traction. And it is not a matter of if Minnesota will legalize sports betting, in my opinion. It is simply a matter of when. Will it be this year or next? It is likely coming to us. And so with that, it's important to know its impact. Both, lots of people like to tout the positives of these type of things, and there's some legitimacy to the positive outcomes when we take something out of the underground and make it legal and regulate it. There are some definite benefits to that. But you can't have an honest conversations without also acknowledging the negative outcomes and the consequences. And one of the big things, and thus the title of today's presentation, is its impact on young people, young men and males, very much specifically. And that is a story that is sweeping across this country, not just here, but what we're learning in having 6 years of legalized sports betting outside of Nevada and New Jersey, its impact on young people and primarily young men, as we'll come to see as the data kind of sorts out. So, yeah, so you can just see these headlines right here. They start to tell us the story of why this matters. So when you think about the evolution of sports betting and like how we got here, right? So for unless you've studied this or a historian, you likely don't even know when or how or why we have illegal and now legal sports betting. And so if you think about in the history of this country, I mean, gambling is about as old as time, right? So if you think about this country specifically, we didn't really care that much about it as a federal government, about the criminality of it or the legalization or even regulation of gambling up until like the turn of 1900. And in the early 1900s, as we started adopting more federal, chemical laws related to drugs and other type of crime, we started paying attention to sports betting, and we basically criminalized it across this country in the 1930s. Although we allowed Nevada as a state and New Jersey a little bit later to continuing to allow wagering on sports. And that was the story of this country for the next 80 years, was that it was illegal to wager on sports, save if you were in Nevada or New Jersey, and not even just the entire state of New Jersey, but specifically to Atlantic City in New Jersey. And so what that did was that it created an underground market for sports betting. And so if you wanted to wager on sports, because people did, they had to go to, places like bookies, right? They had to know somebody who would take their money and they would wager it. And that's often connected to organized crime and gangs and that type of thing. And so that was the way in which we gambled. We gambled on sports, at least in those states outside of where it was legalized. Then something happened in 2018. And so in 2018, the Supreme Court struck down the federal law that banned betting on sports and made it a states' rights issue. So they took the federal prohibition off of sports betting and said each individual state can decide if they want to participate in this, sort of like what they've done with cannabis and marijuana. And so that has created, as you can see there on the top right, lots of casinos have now in those states, in those 38 states, have opened sports books or parts of their casino where people can go and wager on sports. But it doesn't stop there. They've literally brought the casino to your living room, to your couch. In the states where it's legalized, most of those states have the ability to wager on sports via your phone and different types of apps. And so we've gone a long ways from needing to find a bookie in a dark alley to make your bet. And if you didn't settle up that bet, them breaking your legs, to now, within a matter of seconds in those states where it's legalized, you can bet on the outcome of all sorts of things, not just football games and basketball and hockey, but all sorts of things can be wagered on with the flick of a button on your smartphone. And so that's quite the evolution. And the big tipping point was again 2018 when they made sports gambling a states' rights issue. And so, as I mentioned, now it's dominated, by those casinos that have sports books, but also those online apps. And there are dozens. This is just a few different online applications that people can use, young and old, to make these bets. You probably recognize some of these companies because they advertise, as we'll learn, ad nauseum during sporting events to get people participating in the gambling. But yeah, we've gone from bookies in the dark alley to FanDuel and Caesar Sportsbooks while you're at home on your couch and betting on golf games in Australia, right? Like it has come so far and so fast. When you compare it to other, you know, um, activities, right? Risky activities, we'll call them, things like drugs, right? So, I mean, drugs have been around a very long time. It's a very similar pathway, except for, again, now you have the ability to access it right from your phone. So, yeah, it's come a long ways, and in my estimation, it's happened so quickly. So when you think about the business, why this matters, or why it's, maybe I'll put it this way, why no matter what I would say or what the research will show, it's not going away. Let's put it that way. The genie is out of the bottle, as some would say, and it's never going back in. And you can see on this slide the answer to why it's never going back in the bottle. And it is because this is a billion-dollar industry, and not just a single billion, but approaching $200 billion annually being bet on the outcome of US sports. So this is not in totality of all gambling, right? This isn't about poker and blackjack and horse racing. This is literally about what's being wagered on sporting events in the United States. And so you can see that year over year across this country, as more states have legalized it, that we have seen an increase in the amount of money going into this activity. And these numbers come from the American Gaming Association. But to kind of put it in comparison, because I think sometimes when you look at numbers, you're like, when you get to 200 billion, you're like, what does that even mean? Like, I need some reference point to how does that compare? And so if you look at, like, I call it the sin pie, right? And I don't mean anything like religious by that, but like the sin pie is like your alcohol use, your cannabis, your gambling. You could throw some other activities in there. But if you look at the pie of people who spend money on those activities, I mean, this piece of the pie keeps getting larger. The largest is alcohol. And you can see there that alcohol sales last year in this country were over 260 billion. So it's still the leader in the clubhouse, or it's still the largest piece of the pie, but their piece is shrinking. And you probably have seen some headlines over the past month or so that have indicated as much, that alcohol use in the US has kind of plateaued and stagnated, and in some places even started to decline. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. And one of them is that there's only so much sin pie to go around, and some of those dollars that maybe historically might have been spent on happy hours or things, like that, are now being allocated to betting on March Madness or the Super Bowl or whatever else might be coming. So I just think it's important to recognize just how big of a deal this is from an economic standpoint, and why, no matter how much negative outcomes we can show, that this is not going anywhere, that this is only growing and projects to become even larger than it is today. And you can have your opinion on whether that's a good or a bad thing. It's just, it is what it is. And those numbers don't surprise me one bit, particularly the pace in which they are escalating. So if we take the big sports betting industry and we start to like narrow it down into the group that we're most interested in learning about its impact, which are adolescent and teenagers. And so you can imagine, as it becomes legalized, there is more access to it, and with more access comes more use. That is a phenomenon that happens everywhere. Anytime that you legalize something that has historically been illegal, you see a bump in use of it. It just becomes more accessible. You don't have to go find a bookie. You don't even have to drive to a casino. You literally just have to download an app, and voila, there you go. And so if you think about just how widespread online sports betting is among our young people. So I'm gonna throw a little bit of data at you, just again to demonstrate why this is as big a deal as it is. And so I pulled some numbers from Monitoring the Future. And so if you're unaware of what Monitoring the Future is, it is the Cadillac study of young, adolescent, teenage, and young adults. and all sorts of behaviors. Primarily, we reference it for things like drug use, but it also talks about sexual health. It talks about physical health. Anyway, the Monitoring the Future comes out every year from the University of Michigan, and it polls people from across the country, from north, south, east, west, from all over, and it kind of gives a national pulse on what's going on with young people. And so in the 2024 Monitoring the Future, they found that, 68% of the youth in this country have gambled on sports in the past year. So that comes straight from Monitoring the Future. So that's a big number, right? And this doesn't indicate that there's 68% of people who do this have a problem or there's negative consequence. It just shows you the number of people who are engaging in this behavior, which is, it's nearly three-fourths of our young people are gambling on sports in the past year. Now, it is Monitoring the Future. We pull the crosstabs out when you start looking at the demographics of who is responding to these questions and in the affirmative of whether they have or haven't. You can see that this is primarily men, young men, individuals who identify as male on the assessment, who are indicating that they are participating in online gambling or gambling on sports in the past year. And that 87% is in line with what we're seeing in Minnesota as well, that there are female identifying young people who gamble. Don't get me wrong. There's a percent of them, but this is by and large a male phenomenon that is occurring. And even if you dig in the crosstabs even deeper, you can see that it's mostly a white male identifying young person who is engaging in these behaviors. Doesn't mean that nobody else is. It just, you get it. It just shows you kind of who the target is for a lot of these behaviors. So if we look a little bit closer with this data at Minnesota, just to give you some idea of what our students are telling us, there's an opportunity here at the end that I'd like to hear from you if you think these numbers are an over exaggeration or they're not necessarily capturing the real picture. I will give you kind of I will give you kind of what do they call those? A spoiler. When I go out and do this, most people say these numbers aren't accurate and that this is an underreporting of what they're seeing with their own eyes with the young people they're working. But so we have a similar phenomenon where we capture data from young people, like Monitoring the Future, that's specific to our students. It's the Minnesota Student Survey. It's put together by the Minnesota Department of Education and Health. Not all school districts in Minnesota participate, but the majority of them do. It comes out every 3 years. So we just got some fresh data within the last few months. The 2025 student survey data was available to be able to kind of be perused. And there's lots of good things that came out in the 2025 student survey. We made some gains in some of our concerns with children's mental health, right? It's still very much an issue, but we're seeing the trend go the other way. So it's a great instrument for people like me and you, for everyone who wants to better understand what's going on with young people. So I've pulled the gambling specific questions, which there are not many, but I pulled those specific ones out to kind of show you, what's happening nationally and what's happening a little bit closer to home. And so what I pulled was the 11th graders. So you could pull the data from 8th and 9th and 10th. I just went straight to 11th graders to kind of show you what's happening with our 16, 17-year-olds in Minnesota. And so as you can see here, they ask them, what activities have you participated in? And these are specific to gambling. And for those who answered in the affirmative, right? So not every student gambles, right? I mean, the overwhelming majority of them don't gamble, as we'll come to see here. But that for the percent of the young people who do, that the highest number of the greatest rated activity, I should say, is gambling on games of personal skill. So, young people are betting on poker. They're playing poker nights, or they're playing video games and gambling on the outcomes of how good they are at games against you, or pool, golf, etc. Things that they have some control over because it's about personal skill. But then if you go to the next highest level of gambling, you see there that is them betting on sporting events, to include esports. But that this is where they don't have any control other than what they know. They're not participating, but they are gambling on some specific outcome, either the score or some statistic that might happen during the game. But it just kind of shows you, for those who are gambling, this is a growing part of the pie for what is being gambled on. If we were to compare this to 2022, we would see roughly similar numbers of those who are gambling, but the percentage in changing and the sports betting and that's due to some of the accessibility that we'll get into here in a moment. So for those, this kind of gives you an idea of the frequency of how often people are betting. So one thing the Monitoring the Future study did was just tell us how many. They didn't necessarily break it down into, well, of the near 70% of kids who are gambling, here is the frequency. Well, Minnesota does that. And so they asked them to how often are you gambling on, this question was specific to sporting events. So not just gambling entirely, but to those kids who identified that they gamble on sporting events, they'd ask the question of the frequency. And so you can see there that, it's the leader in frequency is just once or twice. So it's a very casual, recreational type thing. I would consider once, twice, and once or twice a month even to be more in that casual kind of social gambling range. When you start getting into a weekly or daily, now we're talking about a more concerning pattern of gambling. And the good news for Minnesota is that that's a small percent. It's hard to say it's a small number because we're talking about, over 400 11th graders in the state of Minnesota who are indicating gambling on sports once a week or even daily. So it kind of gives you some pause when you look at those are actually kids in our community, but from a statistical and numbers breakdown, it's a smaller percent compared to either not at all or just in those casual ways. So one of the things I like about the student survey when we're looking at data is its impact. And we ask kids about the impact. And so, one of the questions that we like to ask is how often they hide it from their family, their parents, even their friends, teachers. And so, during the past year, the frequency in those who stated they gambled, how often did they hide it? You can see it's a pretty big number. It's 7.7% sometimes hid their gambling. We're just under 3% were many, and then all of the time was 6.3. So it kind of gives you an idea a little bit of they're engaging in this behavior and they don't want other people to know, which is a component of the pathology of gambling disorder, as we'll come to learn a little bit later this afternoon. The second question is asking, have you ever felt that you might have a problem with gambling or betting? And so, almost 90% say they've never felt that way. These are the people who are casual bettors. They might bet once or twice, even once or twice a month, but never really feel like that's an issue for them. It's just kind of part of their culture, part of their social fabric. But you can see there that we do have some young people who are indicating that sometimes they think they have a problem with gambling. And a little bit smaller are saying many and even a few people, 125 juniors across Minnesota, are all the time thinking that they have a problem with gambling. So it kind of gives you just this 30,000-foot overview of what young people are experiencing, the frequency of their gambling, what they think as the impact and its secrecy, and whether or not they think they have the problem. All of that is really helpful information. particularly as we compare it to previous years where we've asked these questions, and we can see the trend line going the other direction. Sort of like when the dollars are going up in the amount that is being wagered, so are some of these frequencies and challenges that come with it for our young people. So that is the why. Now, I want to ask you, and I get it's hard in this webinar, and so I'm going to see if I can't see anything in the chat or the Q&A, but what have you seen? Do these numbers seem in line with your experience, or do you think these numbers are actually higher or lower? So even if you can't dump anything in the chat, if you could put in the Q&A whether or not you think these numbers are higher or lower, and if you want to expound on that, that is appreciated as well. So just kind of curious with this group participating today, whether or not they think these numbers are in line. I'm guessing we can't use the chat. That's usually a pretty easy way to participate. So if anybody wants to try to speak, I can see if I can unmute. Yeah, I don't think I can do that either. So, these pesky webinars, they make it so like I have to be all lectury at you. But we do have someone reporting here in the Q&A. For those who don't have it open, I'll just read it out. So this person says, this is a completely new phenomenon, so it's all new to me. So kind of, and you're not alone. The number of people who have approached me after these workshops and trainings that said, I had no idea about this at all. You're in the majority, unless you're working in the schools or working directly with students engaged in this behavior. It's often under the radar, as we'll come to see. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I'll just give it one more minute to see if others would say that what we're seeing in Minnesota makes sense, or you think it's higher or lower. All right, well, we'll move on, and we'll kind of take a look at e- like why then? What is drawing young people in? Why are we seeing this increase of online sports betting, both across the country, but also oh, there's another one here. Another person states, I don't think our school's digital literacy program discusses the issue. That's very common. And as I'll allude to here later, part of the problem that we're not having these conversations about this issue. And it will be a problem because when it'll be too late, once the issues are starting to happen with your school or within your community, talking about it then is helpful, don't get me wrong, but you'll have missed the opportunity to catch them a little bit earlier on. And so when we examine kind of what draws young people into gambling, right? So you have to think about like how has the gambling industry been able to capture the youth of this country and specifically young men? And there's a couple of phenomenons that occur. And the first one is peer influence. And what I mean by that is what is the culture of gambling? So when you think about what young people think about gambling, wagering money, it is a culture of coolness, right? To play fantasy football, to gamble on things. It doesn't have a stigma attached to it like other behaviors. It is a very socially and culturally acceptable behavior. And so that leads a big part of it because no young kid wants to do something that is unacceptable, particularly socially unacceptable. People always wonder, like, why did kids stop smoking cigarettes? And most people think it's because of our efforts to educate them that cigarettes are bad for them. And I'm sure that has played a part, but it's a very small part because we have known cigarettes are bad for people since 1964 that we finally admitted it, right? So it's not like, oh, in 20, in the 2000s when cigarette smoking started declining, that it was because we started realizing how bad it was for you. No, the reason we stopped smoking cigarettes, particularly youth stopped smoking cigarettes, is because smoking is gross. You ask a young person about a cigarette, they think it's gross. So the culture, the influence of that activity went from something that was positive to a neutral. When I was growing up, it wasn't a good or a bad thing, to now it's a very bad thing. Nobody smokes. You're gross if you smoke. Where gambling doesn't have that stigma attached to it whatsoever. You're cool. It is part of an acceptable culture. And there's so much so that there's even this fear of missing out, FOMO, of like when people are gambling on, things like the Super Bowl, which is coming up in a few weeks, and March Madness, which is a few weeks after that. There is this kind of cultural ingraining that has happened with these, high stakes events where it becomes acceptable and promoted to engage in that. And speaking of promotion, I mean, social media promotion of gambling is a big part of that. We are inundating young people and old people alike with content related to gambling. It is, again, it's a $200 billion industry. There is a lot of money going into this. And so it makes sense that there's such an intentionality behind promoting it. And when you think about that intentionality, just in dollars, for example, the amount that's spent in advertising for these sporting, like online sporting apps. If you are somebody who watches sports, you have likely seen the commercial for DraftKings or MGM Bet, right? Because they spend a lot of money. This data comes from the first week of the NFL season. So for the National Football League, which owns a day of the week on Sunday, for that first week, they spent over $24 million in advertising. They are putting this in front of anybody who is watching the the culture of sports betting. And if you've seen any of these advertisements, they often use sports figures, right? They'll take a Wayne Gretzky or they'll take another, celebrity and they'll put them in this commercial and they'll sensationalize betting on sports. And it's not just advertising on television, the whole influencer world, which is not one that I really participate in, but it is very influential. There are people who make their living on social media giving advice, and people are following these people and watching them and learning from them, and it's all related to gambling on sports. Maybe one of the most well-known influencer is a gentleman by the name of Vegas Dave. And this is somebody who, you know, talks about gambling every day, all day on his social media. And he's often only talking about his wins, right? He'll showcase how often he is right and all of the money that he is winning. And it just becomes, you can see how young people are influenced by that, the inundation of material and content related to gambling on sports. So maybe one of the top three, we'll call it a top three predictors of young people engaging in risky behaviors, right? So we'll say in the top three, like, predictors of whether or not little Johnny or little Susie is going to engage in a risky behavior, is a phenomenon known as perception of risk. And perception of risk has an inverse correlation, meaning the more risky somebody thinks a behavior is, the less likely they are to do it. And so if somebody thinks an activity is not very risky, they are much more likely to do that. And there's no better example to highlight that than drugs. Look at the number of kids who are using heroin. It's a very small number. It's not even statistically significant in the student survey. It's such a tiny percent of young people who are using heroin. Now, they have access to heroin from the same drug dealers who are giving them their Adderall and their Vicodin and their benzodiazepines, but they're not doing those drugs because their perception of risk of heroin is extremely high. They have been told that drugs like heroin and meth are really bad for them, and they believe it. So they're not going to do those drugs. But when you look at the perception of risk for, say, cannabis, it's very low. So it makes sense why young kids are using cannabis because they don't think it's bad for them. Maybe the best example of this is vaping. We saw vaping coming about 4 years before it actually became an epidemic in high schools. It's since kind of plateaued and even made some gains in the number of students using, vape products, but we saw vaping coming because the perception of risk was near zero. Young people believed that vaping was harmless. And so you could see then why we had this explosion based on this predictive statistic perception of risk. So, what to remember is the more risky someone, particularly young people, think an activity is, the less likely they are to do it. And the good news for this one is this one's within our range of control. We can't control if the state of representatives legalize sports betting. Unless you're going to run for public office, you don't get to control that outcome. But this is one that we do have some sense and control over because we can educate people about its potential risk. Like cannabis, it's absurd to me that kids think that there's no danger with the use of THC. Like that is a failure on us. As parents, as teachers, as clinicians, like we have to do a better job of educating young people about that. So when you think about online gambling, do you think that perception of risk is high for gambling or low? And it's not one you actually have to answer, but because of the layout of the webinar, but it's obvious, and you already know the answer to this, that it's low. It's very low. That essentially young people see no risk whatsoever in gambling on sports. And this has been proven in multiple studies where they ask these questions, right? So there's a great journal of gambling studies that does all sorts of great work around gambling. And one of them is they often check in with perception of risk and gambling and over again, not just young people, but adults alike don't think there's much harm in gambling. And the reality is there's probably not, right? That the overwhelming majority of people who wager on fantasy football and even maybe bet on the outcome of the Super Bowl, there are very few, if any, negative consequences. I would be lying to you today if I told you I didn't do those things. I play fantasy football. I am a huge fantasy baseball nerd, right? Like that is my hobby. I don't see what is wrong with that. I mean, I gamble a few $100s a year, right? So it's for me, I think that there's very low risk for myself. But you can see then if everybody is thinking that there's going to be those who do start to struggle with that. And so when you look at the perception of risk of gambling, particularly online sportsbook gambling on your phone, it is very, very low. And so another phenomenon that's happened, and I think is important to note, so not only do they think it's not harmful, these industries have gone out of their way to make you think you're getting a good deal in gambling. So there was another study that looked at how these bonuses, like how it changes youth's perception of gambling. And so you could do it right now. You could download the DraftKings app on your phone or the Prize Pick'ems or any of those apps that we have, and they will start flooding you with these offers where if you put in 20 bucks, we'll match you. Or if you bet $5, we're going to give you $200 on the back end. And for young people, what this study showed was that they then not only understand this not to be harmful, they think it's a good deal. It's kind of like getting something on sale. You're much more willing to buy it because you think you're getting a good deal. But the reality is that these are not good deals, that these incentives, trust me, if these worked against the industry, they wouldn't be offering them. They are offering them because it is a very good deal for them to get you foot in the door to try to get you connected and hooked to their product, right? So it's just interesting that it not only like drugs don't have to like combat this. Like your local drug dealer or your local dispensary isn't giving you these like bonuses for participating in that behavior. And so this is an industry that gets to do that, and we're seeing how that can suck young people in. And it's not new. It's not new. And for those who are about my age range, this might look familiar. This is a scheme as old as time, right? Making you think you're getting a good deal on the front end, and then they really make their money on the back end. And if any of you can remember the days of magazines, right? You probably had seen the Columbia House ad for, you can get 8 CDs for a penny, right? Like what a screaming deal. Now, if you read the fine print, you then have to buy so many CDs at their price of it. And trust me, they make their money back and then some in these programs. And so we've been doing this a long time. I did this guilty, right? This was before they asked for a credit card. They just gave you like a little postcard where you picked your 8 CDs, sent it in, and I got a box like 3 weeks later with all these CDs. I paid zero attention that they were billing me for these other CDs that I didn't even want or pick, but CDs just kept coming. And eventually my mom figured out what was going on and realized that I owed Columbia House something like $400, right? So I had like 20 CDs for $400. Not a very good deal. And that's what those gambling schemes are also about, right? So this isn't new, this phenomenon, but young people like I was don't understand that, and they get caught up in those games. So if we think about perception of risk as being a top three predictor of who's going to gamble, I wanted to ask, the best predictor. So there is a very clear-cut number one, best predictor of negative social outcomes in children. And so this includes predicting which kids are going to start online gambling and thus develop problems later. The best predictor for that. Anybody want to guess in the Q&A? I'll give it just a second because I do think this is a kind of it's an important one. As a prevention scientist and somebody who's studied this in lots of different ways, there is a very clear best predictor of negative social outcomes. I want one person to guess. I teach freshmen, so I can wait here for a whole class period. Thank you, anonymous attendee. Lack of parent oversight. You are like on a dartboard, you are near the bullseye with there. You are very close to that. The number one predictor of every negative social outcome in children. I'm talking about who uses drugs, who gets pregnant, who is truant, who is gambling on sports, is parental involvement. So parental oversight, it is like right in there, like parental involvement. The more involved parents are in young people's lives, the less likely a negative social outcome. Now, of course, we all know the kid who had terrible parents and they got their act together and, did wonderful things. Of course, there are those outliers. And on the same end, we all know the kid who has great parents who were super involved and they ended up falling into lots of negative social outcomes. I get that there are outliers, but for the most part, over and over again, research shows us parental involvement is the best predictor in negative social outcomes. So when you think about gambling and online sports betting, we have to think about, well, okay, well, how involved are parents in this realm? Well, we don't have to wonder. The University of Michigan, the Mott's Children's Hospital, did a study on this. And so they do all sorts of, again, children's health studies. And one of them recently, within the last 18 months, examined this issue about how aware are parents of young people, their kids betting, online gambling, right? Because as our first comment in the Q&A stated that this is a new phenomenon. They had no idea, and they're not alone because when Mott did this study, you can see the data here that only 2% of parents think their teen has used an online betting platform. I mean, Now, this is a national study, so let's compare it to monitoring the future. And monitoring the future put that number close to 70%. So talk about a pretty big disconnect between what parents think is going on and what is actually going on. And if parental involvement is your best predictor, that is a recipe for disaster. Only 8% of parents in this study admitted that they would know if their teenager had gambled. So less than 10% of moms and dads and caregivers out there would even know. And count me among them. Like, I think about my oldest, Owen, and I'm like, there's no way he's gambling on sports. He doesn't like sports, right? He doesn't like those things. But I don't really know, right? I mean, I check his activity with some frequency, but there are so many of those apps and things out there that I just don't know about. And I work in this industry and I still don't know about them. So it makes sense that it's a relatively small amount of parents who admit that they would know if their kid gambled at all. One of the other um, highlights from this study that I think helps us understand this issue is that nearly 70% of parents report that their teen has a bank account, a debit card, even a credit card in their own name. So when you think about this activity, yeah, gambling requires money to wager, right? So, but these youth have money. They have their own account and heaven forbid, a credit card account that can be compromised and used in these ways. And so it just shows you again the depth of this issue is yeah, we don't really know that much about it as moms and dads, even as the clinical community, but it is a growing issue. And the evidence suggests that year over year, we're seeing this become a much bigger issue. I mean, think about if we could have got ahead of vaping. Think about if we knew what we know now about vaping in 2015, what we could have done with those numbers in Minnesota, how we could have attacked, kids' perception of risk and policies related to nicotine and those things, but we didn't. And so this is a very similar phenomenon. I'm not saying that gambling is going to blow up like vaping did, or even to the degree that cannabis has and will continue, but it's still an issue. It's an issue for our young people. And it's ultimately like we have the perfect storm, right? A great 1990s, early 2000s film, right? The perfect storm and recipe for adolescent sports betting problems. One, we talked about the cultural acceptance that this is an activity that is not only not stigmatized, it is celebrated. It's in some way like alcohol has been in this country, right? Like alcohol is the only drug that we celebrate its use. We have holidays dedicated to drinking. We have, I mean, just American culture is often centered around alcohol. Not everybody, obviously, but just if we kind of lump America is as in one culture, it's celebrated. And that's what's happening with gambling. And like we think of like again, for the most part, it isn't this really bad thing. People play fantasy football, they bet on sports, but it's the Trojan horse that just allows it to be accepted. Accepted in such a way that entices young people to come in to start engaging. And then you add the everybody's doing it attitude, that peer influence piece, right? That I'm missing out if I'm not doing it, or those that piece of it as well. That social influence is a big part. And you pair that with that cultural acceptance, and it makes a lot of sense. Um, Awareness gap in caregivers. We've said the best predictor of negative social outcomes is parental involvement. And even the most involved parents, if they're unaware that this is an issue or something they should be talking about, creates this awareness gap, which then kind of puts, again, another opportunity into creating this perfect storm. The lower perception of risk, it can't get much lower. In fact, there is no risk. And in fact, many of the young people who engage think there's a value to online gambling. And then the last one, and this is the one that Minnesota is considering, is to make it accessible. obviously young people can gamble on their phone today, that it is accessible. It is already something that is occurring. But once it becomes formally legalized in Minnesota, you're going to see a flood of dollars coming in to get people signed up for these online sports betting apps. So the last step in this is making it accessible. And if you look at the states that have, you would see an increase in online sports betting for young people because it becomes acceptable. Now, people will tell me, well, Thad, the gambling age in Minnesota is 18. So why are we worried about 16 or 17-year-olds gambling? And then I would say, you know what else you have to be 18 to access? Pornography sites. But you know what? You know how they keep people out of pornography sites? They just make you put your birthday in. And so all of those like self-policing, like tell us your birthday, that just teaches kids to get really good at subtracting 18 from the current year. Like it's not the same as going to the casino where a security guard can look at your driver's license. It's not the same as going to the liquor store, right? There are different safeguards in place for that. But when you bring the casino into your phone, you lose a lot of that safeguarding. And so it just becomes more and more accessible. And so here's a question here. Are there books or other media available that is teenage friendly, that they will watch and consume that can inform them about the risks of online gambling? Yes. And we're going to get to some of the more local resources we have here. And if that doesn't satisfy what you're looking for, send me an email. There are some great prevention, there are some great education, platforms, media that can be consumed. Again, that is friendly to them. That isn't some cop telling them don't do this, but rather just talking about the reality. Because we're going to get to that. Like, really, you're that person. You're the person in those young people's lives who can just have a conversation with them about, look, this is culturally accepted. I'm not even saying don't do it, but if you're going to do it, here are the actual potential risks. And we'll talk about those here next. Because ultimately, what is the big deal? You've heard me say a couple of times here that when we compare this issue with cannabis use, alcohol use, I mean, heaven forbid, suicide or serious mental health issues, it isn't in the ballpark as a big a deal as those issues. And so I don't want to minimize this issue, but I also just want to acknowledge that, yeah, when we have so much that we have to be concerned about, like how big of an issue is this? Well, it's not to those degrees, but it's still an issue. And it's one that will continue to get bigger and worse. And we know that right? We know that evidence has shown us that for a very long time. This is more just geared towards gambling in itself. And so when we look at the risks, what is the big deal? What are the psychological risks of introducing gambling like this to young people? And so there's a number of things here, right? So you can read these in their entirety. I'll just kind of highlight what some of the research has told us about the psychological risks of gambling for young people. And so you think about impulsivity and underdeveloped self-control. So, young people, right? The last part of our brain that maturates is our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision making. That's why when we say you're immature, what we're actually saying is you have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, which when you evaluate if this is a good decision or not, you often don't arrive on good decisions. And if you don't believe me, just go back in your Facebook account like 20 years ago and look at some of the things that you said and look at some of the things that you were wearing. And your brain today is like, oh, ooh, I said that, I thought that, I wore that, right? So as our brain maturates, we make better decisions. And so for young people, when we start to like, it's harder for them to evaluate risk and they lose a little bit of that self-control when it comes to making good decisions, and it becomes more compulsive that way. There is this illusion of control with sports betting specifically, and I'll put it this way. Kids think they know things. They think they know hockey. right? They know the Minnesota Wild are really good, or they know that the Minnesota Timberwolves and Anthony Edwards, they're going to beat the Atlanta Hawks because I watch Sports Center and I read the newspaper, and they think they have an edge in some capacity because of how smart they are. And then, like, what I want to show those kids are the casinos and tell them that they didn't build these huge, beautiful buildings from losing, right? That these people know they know exactly what they're doing. And you might win once in a while, but they are going to win over time more often than not. And so, that when you start to plant that seed into a young person's head, that's where those compulsive and problematic patterns can begin. I've said before, like the worst thing that can happen for a teenager who gambles is they win, right? And I guess I don't want them to lose, but in some way I do, right? Because like if what their first experience is that they win, then they start to think that they are good at this and they like it. It's like you kind of want them to have that taste of like, yeah, you don't know what you're doing, kid, and you just lost $100, which is a lot of money to you. So that illusion of control is a big part of that psychological risk, which then just carries with them as they become young adults. Kids will use gambling as a coping strategy, emotional regulation, sort of what they do with substances, right? That you'll have a kid who's struggling emotionally or in some other way, and they lean into gambling as a way to emotionally regulate or cope with that, which over time is going to be problematic for them. And so, lastly, some other ones up there, but what we know pretty clearly is that there's a high comorbidity with gambling and other risk-taking behaviors. So, primarily drinking. Drinking and gambling are two very connected activities. But we know with kids, truancy is another big one. When kids start missing school because they're hyper focused on the game or hyper focused on preparing for or betting on the game, that's a problem. So that comorbidity that on its own might have smaller consequence, but when you start stacking some of these other risk-taking behaviors, it can become more problematic. So the big takeaway as far as psychological risk, the mental health risk of adolescent sports betting is that it offers instant excitement, but can entrap teens in cycles of risk, shame, emotional dependence, long before adulthood, that these are patterns of behavior that don't just magically stop when you turn 18 or you move out of the house, that these become lifelong problems, right? I've never met, I mean, I shouldn't say I never met, but it's rare to see a teenager who is a full-blown struggling with alcohol use disorder, right? We're talking about an alcoholic. Are there some? Yeah, yeah, yeah. But for the majority, it doesn't happen until later. But if you trace back, if you look at the etiology of adult alcoholism, it often starts with problematic patterns as adolescents and young adults. And so that is no different when it comes to gambling, that this cycle is learned and it is hard to unlearn for a lot of these young people. So when they say there's no risk to gambling, it's not true, right? That there are substantial psychological risks when it comes to gambling online. Does this happen to everybody? No. Does it happen to the majority of people? No. Does it happen to some? Yes. Who are those some? I don't know. That's what makes this, this what makes it so important for people to know what they're kind of getting into. So maybe even beyond like your traditional chemical use addiction, there's a whole nother level of risk that comes with gambling. Yes, there are financial risks with having a drug addiction or alcoholism. Yes, there are, but this is directly connected to the addiction or the problem, right? The gambling, the wagering of money. And oftentimes, wagering money that you don't have, you are borrowing or you're putting it on credit. I don't know many drug dealers, but for the few that I know, they're not taking a credit card. You don't get to pay in advance or pay later for those products. You have to pay now. But with gambling and the way money works, it isn't uncommon for young people to access credit, money they don't have to gamble. And that is where that financial risk really comes in. I knew this I knew this as a researcher and as a clinician, this was a phenomenon. I saw it in my office this summer. I worked with a family who had a teenager who was over $40,000 in credit card debt, that he had been taking out credit cards and lines of credit unknown to his parents. And once they finally figured it out, was over $40,000 in debt. And all of it, he wasn't buying clothes and cars and gas. He was gambling. He was gambling online with one of those apps and putting that money on credit. And so that is a huge financial risk. You're talking about starting your life in the hole, in a financial hole that is often hard to get out of, right? And so yeah, so many financial risks when it comes to gambling that, yeah, you might win and have a few extra bucks in your pocket, but over time you are going to lose. And so, what that does, and this is maybe a little bit more on the psychological side too, but it normalizes the highs and lows of risk taking, and you have money and you don't. And that isn't normal, right? Like that isn't, and I'm not a financial planner or that is not my expertise, but I know enough to say like we can't normalize betting everything, losing everything, betting everything, losing everything as a successful pattern. And so what this does basically is online betting blurs the line between play, right, having fun, and financial harm, teaching risk without accountability or comprehension. And so might not be your role to teach this part to kids, but there are people out there who can teach financial literacy to young people, and we should be doing a better job of that. Anyway, right? It should start at home. Moms and dads should be doing that, but the general public in our education system should have conversations about financial literacy and how these, particularly gambling, can hurt that. So, what are we looking for when young people are gambling? What are some of the, warning signs, if you will, when it comes to gambling? So, pretty obvious. A couple obvious ones here: money trouble, kids borrowing money, selling their belongings, or being very secretive. I think anytime that you start to see, you know, issues with money, managing money, alarm bells should be going off. It could be that they're, borrowing some money to their friend. I doubt that. There could be some of that, don't get me wrong. But by and large, it probably represents they're in some sort of trouble. They're buying drugs, they're buying, they're gambling with it, or there's something that needs to be paid attention to. Maybe trouble was a bit of a overkill word, I guess, but there's something going on and requires some parental or some professional questioning, some asking about what's going on with this money situation. And then anytime you start to see, changes, highs and lows. That's a warning sign for all sorts of different things, right? Mental health issues, drug use, gambling. The problem is so many of these kids are also going through puberty, which kind of creates an unpredictable high and low environment already. So you have to sift through what is just that normal development, emotional dysregulation, and what represents a substantial change for that young person and why those mood swings are going and connected the way in which they are. I didn't mention this earlier, but I will now, like, is part of this like mood swing and it being tied to the outcome of the game, something that hasn't been empirically studied. So I can't point to like a journal article about this. But Lauren and I were talking about this phenomenon before you all hopped on, is gambling takes away what I think, and I shouldn't paint such a broad brush, not for everybody, but for some people, particularly who are struggling with gambling, it takes away the fun of sports. Like sports exist in our culture for one reason, and it's entertainment. That is it, right? I mean, it's a huge economic driver, yada, yada, yada. People like to play it, but it's entertainment. And once we introduced gambling on the outcome, for some people, it wasn't about entertainment anymore. You're not watching sports because it's it's fun and it's enjoyable. it becomes a stress point. It becomes a win or a loss. And it robs the joy, I guess, of sports for some people. And I know some people who like don't have gambling problems, but have said as much that, when their team wins, but they bet on the other team, it's kind of it's not the same. So it's just again, I can't quantify it in an empirical way, but I think about that mood swing and young people going from this way to that way related to the outcome of games or players' performance. And I can't help but interject the phenomenon of the loss of joy. So when I talk to my kids about this, that will be part of the conversation that look, my oldest doesn't like to watch sports, but I imagine my younger two who are a little more rough and tumble will. And so yeah, having that conversation that yeah, gambling on sports might add some level of excitement for you, but it crosses a line at a certain point, and then it not only takes excitement away, it robs the joy of the experience. So I just wanted to make sure I plug that one in. That's more of Thad's opinion than any sort of empirical fact, but I've seen it and it makes sense to me. When we see changes in academics, right? So these kids who are constantly thinking about the line in the game and who's starting tonight and who's injured. And when they're hyper focused on the outcome of these events, they're less focused on their academics. And then as a result, their academics will likely suffer. So when grades start to slip, attendance starts to slip, it should be again one of those flags or alarm bells that go off and say, require you to ask like what's going on, what is helping explain this sudden change in presentation. And then secrecy, we looked at the Minnesota student survey data on this, that of those who are gambling, there's a large percentage of those kids who are saying that they're hiding it. And so some of it could be because parental expectation, like mom and dad wouldn't approve of it. But some of it might be because they're having a problem with it, that they're not wanting to talk about it, or they're wanting to hide things because they're starting to get in over their head and they don't want to bring in that caregiver or that professional. And so when you're seeing that secrecy or that lying about behavior related to, using their phone or their bank account, that's another alarm bell. So you put enough of these alarm bells together, and it's the warning signs for you to ask to just have that conversation. And we'll talk about ways in which you can get involved here as we kind of get towards the end of our time together. But I did just want to highlight these warning signs. Now, sports betting is one of several things young kids are wagering and gambling on. And this is where I said earlier we could spend a whole day on this topic because I've intentionally focused on sports betting and kind of putting it in a silo because it's a much more pressing issue, given the potential legalities around it and policy shifts, and just the culture around sports betting. But this story doesn't end with the outcome of a sporting event, that there are a multitude of things that young people are engaging in this risk-taking behavior. And that's what it is. They're risking money for the hope of more, but when they lose, like it's all that risk. And so when you think about what's beyond sports betting, and there's not near as much literature on this. This is an opportunity to really learn more about this other world. So if anybody's looking for their dissertation topic, I'd love to read more evidence-based material on the gambling on these other things. I know in March, MACMA is having Zach Hansen from Hazleton. He's a good buddy of mine. He was in my wedding. Zach is an expert on video game disorder, and there is a connection. So if you do this one and Zach, you're going to see in Zach's presentation, this is a connection point where kids aren't just betting on the outcome of football and hockey games, but they're wagering on the outcome of video games. Video games sometimes that they're playing themselves, And other times they're watching other people play video games and they are wagering on the outcome of those games. So there's some gambling in that way as it pertains to gaming. But even beyond just like wagering money on an outcome in video games, within the video games themselves has become this whole ecosystem of spending money. I don't know any other way to put it. I don't want to say it's necessarily gambling, but it's like, and it's hard for me to like talk about this concretely. I don't play these games, and there's not a lot of research out there on this, so I'm kind of spitballing a little bit. But evidently, there are these games, Fortnite, Call of Duty, where people play online, and you can make in-game purchases. You can buy things that make you a better player. And while it's not the same as gambling per se, wagering on an outcome, it becomes this compulsive risk-taking behavior as it pertains to spending money, wagering money on these these games, right? They're video, they're not in real life, but it's very similar to that. I think another phenomenon in this kind of world here, before we move on to the next kind of more stock market gambling, is this explosion of sports collectibles. That there is this almost like gambling around like baseball cards and football cards. And this is quietly becoming a multi-billion dollar industry as well, where people will be spending hundreds of dollars to purchase these boxes of cards in hopes that they get a rare card that is worth a lot of money, that it has become a form of gambling. And much like the sports books that you can put on your phone, there are whole sites, the Whatnot site, where it's like online gambling, like auction houses, where you can gamble on what's inside a sports card box and those type of things. So anyway, it's just to plant that seed as we're kind of expanding your understanding of what our young people are dealing with, that it goes beyond just betting sports. They have video games, and then there's this new phenomenon, which as a parent, I would think is like collecting something, but it is becoming more of a gamble for young people when it comes to those things. This whole collectible market is something that I've heard parents specifically talk about, their kid getting their credit card and racking up a $800 bill on the Whatnot app. And they're like, what is this? And they find out that their kid was buying sports cards at an auction. It's again, if you're not aware of this, you can't intervene and you can't prevent it from occurring in the first place. The other one is it's hard. The other area I want to talk about, it's hard because it represents, I mean, basically, I'm talking about gambling on like stocks and cryptocurrency and that whole banking industry, which for some of us think of that as an investment, think of that as not gambling, but as saving money, right? So it's this last piece here is really hard to, again, quantify because there's not a lot of research or none really when it pertains to like young people's gambling on the stock market. Like when I think about who trades stocks, I have this vision in my head of a guy or a gal in a nice suit on Wall Street who is, gambling on whether Microsoft is going to go up or down. And I get that it's gambling in a very similar sense, but I never thought about young people getting into that, and they are. That this in some respects is approaching the same level of problematic patterns as sports betting. That young people are getting these cryptocurrency apps and they're day trading like they were gambling on the outcome of a baseball game. And so it just adds a whole level of complexity because we want, we want our kids. I mean, on one level, I want to like say, wow, how thoughtful of you to be thinking about your future and investing in retirement. And reality, it's much more like the gambling where they are taking a risk, one that they may not fully understand with money, and they are banking on some outcome. And sometimes those stocks go up and sometimes they go down, right? And there's a much like the casinos, there's a reason why the banks have really big fancy buildings and their CEOs make lots of money. It's because they know what they're doing, and us little guys, we don't. And so it's one of those where yeah, it's going to involve a whole nother level of kind of prevention. And, you talked earlier, one of our participants talked about, prevention media or something that can be consumed to help have this conversation. I know that does not exist for this. It does in sports betting and it might in video gaming. It just doesn't exist in how to talk to your teen about day trading stocks. Like that isn't something we've had to think about. But it is a very similar pattern where kid A bets on Bitcoin to go up. They might put $1,000 on Bitcoin to go up that day. And if it goes up, they sell it and they make the difference. But if it goes down, then they get that loss. That is very similarly to betting on whether the Timberwolves, beat the Bucks tonight or whoever they're playing. It's very similar, but yet society has even further gone further with investing and this type of risk taking as being acceptable and promoted. So I was in North Dakota. This really opened my eyes. I was in North Dakota this fall doing this presentation. And Grand Forks has this it's got an Air Force base. So there's lots of young men, highly concentrated in a very rural type area that is Grand Forks. And I was talking with one of the substance abuse counselors from the base, and she said, Thad, these young men on our base do not have a sports betting problem. Like, yeah, they're doing it, but we're not seeing the highs and lows and all of the consequences that come from, losing $100 on the Super Bowl. She said these young men are crypto trading, that they are making, a year's salary in the military in one day and losing it the next day. And it is just these substantial highs and lows in a whole industry that they know very little about, or much like sports betting, think they know what they're doing, and then in reality end up eating a lot of those losses. And so this clinician was just telling me how this is under the radar, that the average person has no idea that this is going on. And even if they did, they wouldn't see it for what it could be for some of these people, which is just another form of gambling. So essentially the rise of online gambling, sports betting, it's not just sports betting. We're seeing a rise in risk-taking behavior as it pertains to wagering money to gain more. So it's gambling. Any way you want to look at it, call it what you want, but it is risking something for something else. And those patterns can cause problems, as we outlined. So you think about what you can do, right? So many of you on this call live today, and those maybe watching later this year, you're not addiction counselors. You're not going to be the person in the treatment room providing intervention on these issues. That's why we didn't really go into how do we intervene on gambling use disorder, because there probably none of you on this call are doing that. Or if there's a few, it's just a small part. Most of you are school social workers or therapists or, working in counties with at-risk families. And so you're not going to be the one providing the actual intervention, but you are the ones who are going to help us as, collectively, the state of Minnesota, to hopefully lessen the impacts, the negative impacts of the legalization of sports betting and these other phenomenons that are happening. So if you think about the outcome of this training is to increase your knowledge and awareness, that is the overt outcome. Underneath that, what I'm actually hoping for is you use that broadened understanding to help slow this issue down, or at least make a dent into that perception of risk, or to connect with young people on this issue that no one else in their life is. So when you think about your role specifically, whether you're a teacher, social worker, county worker, psychiatrist, whatever your role is in that, education is the big one, right? That you're having these conversations early. I think about Drug prevention. When you look at the history of drug prevention programming, like DARE was meant to be given in high school. That's what it was first designed to do in the early 80s. It was a drug prevention program for high school students. But the intent of DARE is to get to kids before they start using drugs. Well, they're already using drugs in high school, so now then DARE got moved to middle school. And so then they were giving it to eighth and ninth graders and seventh graders. And then they just had to keep pushing it down. I took DARE in the third grade, the third grade. So that shows you if we kind of follow that prevention model of we have to get to people before it becomes a problem to start to inform and change the perception of the activity. We're going to have these conversations with seventh graders, sixth graders, eighth graders. It seems absurd to think about having, gambling conversations with middle schoolers, but we have to. And if we don't, we risk missing that opportunity. And so integrating those literacy and gambling awareness, programs into classrooms, every high school student or every student in Minnesota, high school, middle school, or whatever, has to go through a drug prevention program of some kind, right? Many students go through DARE, many use DARE, and then some others along the way. Well, in those same requirements, why don't we require some conversation around gambling? That should be part of the bill. If I were in St. Paul writing the legal sports betting bill, I would say we have to dedicate some of these dollars into better prevention to young people to demonstrate the risk of online sports betting and gambling. And so, yeah, educating early and often. I think as a parent, seizing the opportunity when it's in real time. So you're sitting around watching the game. Up comes the DraftKings app where they're going to give you 200 bonus dollars if you deposit $5. Using that opportunity to just tell them, that sounds like a great deal, but it's not. And here's the reason, right? It's not because DraftKings is a multi-billion dollar industry. They're never going to lose. They don't do things that have them lose. This is this is your Columbia House moment. And I will share with my kids when I sent in the CD postcard and how I had to learn the hard way that that wasn't a good deal. But I guess it's all about that education and connecting with them and using those opportunities to engage in a conversation. We learned that the knowledge, attitude, behavior model of drug prevention doesn't work. You can't just tell a kid to say no. We tried that. It doesn't work. In fact, it often makes things worse. So it's not about telling your kid they can't do something, but engaging in a conversation about it is going to be a much better outcome. And whether that comes from mom or dad, like it should, or from teacher or social worker or county worker, as long as somebody is having that conversation with them, I think we're going to start making some inroads on that perception of risk. Promote prevention and digital balance. This kind of goes together a little bit with that first one. It's about that prevention through education. What I would encourage you all, and even as an association like MACMA, is to advocate when we write this rule, when we write this law in Minnesota, that we learn from what some other states have done, and we have some restrictions on advertising, right? When you look at the different states and what they've done to prevent some of the negative consequences of online sports betting, they have done things like you can't advertise sports betting apps 30 minutes before the game, during the game, or after the game. So a state law was written that DraftKings, you can't promote your product during the game, right? Like if you want to promote it 2 hours before, the day before, we're a free society, but we're going to write into this law that you can't do it in the middle of the game. Or do you require, DraftKings or FanDuel or whomever is going to move in here to sell their product, that they have to do a better job of verifying ages before you allow a deposit to be made. There are some states that require you to take a photograph of your driver's license and submit that and upload that. There are still ways around that, don't get me wrong, but it's another layer of protection to get these 14-year-olds not to have these gambling apps on their phone. So, yeah, how do we collectively as an industry, those who care about children's mental health, how do we get our voice heard in this? Because we're not going to stop it. It's a $200 billion industry. It's not going anywhere, as we've stated. But we can have a seat at the table and tell them, look, if we're going to do this, fine. But can we at least adopt some common sense prevention things when it comes to our young people? Because we can all agree that even though there's going to be some people who make lots of money, that even the people who are making lots of money don't want to see kids hurt. They want to see kids hooked on their app, but they don't want to see them hurt. And so that's an opportunity for us to say, give us something, give us these restrictions, give us some dollars so we can create the content that is needed to put into our schools to support those who are working with kids, to give them those literacy components that our colleague asked about earlier. I think that's a big part of it as well. So we can do that piece. We can educate, we can advocate. Those are two things within our control. What they do with that advocation and education is out of our control, but at least we've done our part. I think the third component in your role is to watch and respond early. For those who knew nothing about this topic before you hopped on today's webinar, you don't get to have that excuse anymore. Now you know a little bit about online sports betting, its rise, and its consequences. So it's on you now to be able to recognize those warning signs and respond early, to ask those questions, to engage our youth with what's going on, Zach, what's going on, Carl, Susie, whoever. You're engaging in that dialogue, no different than we would if we suspected young kids were struggling with drug use, alcohol use. We would engage them. And so this is just another thing that you have to be thinking about when you're interacting with those young kids. And then to know that you don't have to be the person who is then providing that treatment or care. Now, some of you might be treatment providers and you might feel competence or get some training within your scope of practice to intervene on this issue, but you don't have to. That's the good news. There are some really great professionals here in the state of Minnesota, well, across this country and in the state of Minnesota that can do this, right? So just to know what they are. And so I've given you a couple of the national numbers to be able to cite as a source, or if you're struggling to call, right? Those are the national ones. But right here in Minnesota, we have a great program. And if you're not familiar with the Minnesota Alliance on Problem Gambling, check them out. So Susan over there, their executive director, no better advocate in the state of Minnesota at alerting people from policymakers about the consequences of these rules and laws. And so supporting Susan to get those, to be our best advocate against some of this. But not only is her office advocacy, they don't directly provide treatment. It's not a treatment center by any means, but they can connect you with the folks right here in Minnesota who do that. So let's say you have a young kid, a teenager who is not just struggling with gambling, but is, failing out of school and is $40,000 in credit card debt and can't stop. Even though everybody's trying to help them, they're not able to stop. No different than what we would want if they were doing the same thing with alcohol or drugs. We have those resources as it pertains to gambling as well. So just to familiarize yourself with those groups, yeah, there's some great stuff. And to the colleague on the call who asked about, are there are there resources that we can use in our schools? Are there pamphlets? Are there worksheets? Are there digital content, videos that we can use? The first place I would direct you, the very first place, is to Susan's team over there at the Minnesota Alliance on Problem Gambling. And if they don't have the content that you're looking for, let me know because it exists, it's out there. But I'm very confident, 99.9%, that what you're looking for, Susan will have. And if she doesn't, she will know the best places to go to get it. And if it doesn't exist, she'll let you know that as well. So just want to make sure you can't talk about problems without also giving participants the resources of where to go. when that occurs. So for those who are parents, right? Oh, there's a question here. Hold on. Oh, there we Sonia's on the call. Okay. Sonia, your team, not one of the best, but the best when it comes to this stuff. And so absolutely that team, I just referenced Susan, but that entire team of professionals over there is exactly is exactly the one-stop shop to be able to stop at. And so thank you, Sonia, for putting that in. And if you have other places you want to direct people, you could dump it in the Q&A and I'll make sure it gets promoted as well. But yeah, no, lots of great stuff there. So I do want to just pivot a little bit to for those of us who are parents and those who work with parents. I know sometimes those who work in children's mental health, we all know the secret. It shouldn't be children's mental health. It should be parents' mental health and parents' involvement for a lot of the folks that we serve and work with. So whether you're a parent directly or going to be interacting with parents, you play a huge role in this. I'm often considered old school, I guess, in my thinking, and I'll own it. But like as a society, we have put, again, my opinion, this is Thad's opinion, not anybody else's that I work for or part of, not MACMA's. As a society, we have put too much, I think, on everybody else to raise our kids, that we're asking teachers and counselors and social workers to do the job that we should be doing better at home. I'll just say it. I'll just say it. And I don't know when that became so controversial. I really don't, but it has in some respects. And I used to tiptoe around it. And then told myself, I don't know why I'm tiptoeing around it because the evidence is overwhelming. This part isn't my opinion. The more involved parents are, the better the kids are going to be. Like that isn't debatable. Like that literally is not debatable. Some of my thoughts about parents should do more but this piece right here that we know the more involved parents are, the less risk-taking behavior young people are getting at. And so when you think about how do we engage parents, and sometimes in my experience, because I work with lots of parents, it's a confidence issue. They are pushing this off onto professionals or teachers because they themselves don't have the confidence to have these conversations. Well, that's where we can help. We can help parents build that confidence to have conversations around this issue. First, parents have to educate themselves, right? So for those who are parents on the call, consider yourself a little bit more in the know. I told you you wouldn't leave experts and you're not, but you know now a little bit more, hopefully, than you did when you came in, maybe except for Sonia, because this is like your literal expertise. But for everybody else who doesn't work in gambling, hopefully you know some more today. So first step one is education yourself. And then how do we take that education and impact our kids? That's that next step. And I think, it's not very different than what I asked you as professionals to do, but thinking about parents starting that conversation, talking about it, right? I think if I did this to Owen, he might look at me like, what are you talking about, Dad? But that shouldn't stop me, right? That I should still have that conversation about this is, gambling is, it could be fun. Your dad gambles to some degree, but here are the potential consequences. And here is to know when you might be getting into trouble with those things. But you have to start that conversation, whether it's about gambling, whether that's about drugs, sex. These are conversations moms and dads should be having, or caregivers, whether they're biological mom and dad, whomever is caregiving for that child, you have to have the conversation. That's, I guess, the point where I'm like, maybe that's the controversial point, but you have to. That is your job as mom and dad to have that conversation, to build awareness. It's a part of that conversations, but building that awareness on, you're underestimating the exposure that these kids are getting. Model healthy habits. This is something that if you as a parent engage in, right? Maybe again, I don't have anything against people who gamble. If you're gambling, if you're wagering or playing fantasy football, or you do the crypto trading, then it's a great opportunity to model healthy habits that parents are their children's best teacher. And that is true when it comes to modeling habits and behavior. And so if you have the opportunity to model responsible gambling or responsible crypto trading, you're engaged in the conversation and you're modeling that behavior. That is, again, parents' role to do that. And then to provide tools, not fear. I wish I could tell my dad that. That would have been something. He operated out of the fear model, but he tried. But for us, what we know, what research shows us, is that fear isn't the best teacher. It can work, don't get me wrong, but the best teacher is to, offer the tools, model the behavior, engage in dialogue and conversation. And so to provide those components. And that is true if you're working with parents too, not just parent to child, but you as therapist. If mom and dad are struggling with teenager who is gambling, like I had this summer, leaving them with the resources they need to continue the conversation. And that was, I mean, in that intervention I had with that family, that's what they needed. They were very well educated, very involved parents. They lacked the confidence in knowing what this issue was even about. And so we used our sessions to provide that education and to give them those resources so they could continue to have that conversation and engage in those resources. They didn't need a therapist to do that. As mom and dad, they could. Now, if that kid needed a professional, the good news is we have them. We have one on the call today, right? We have the people who can help with those situations. So let's do a quick case study. I usually like to do these when we can interact. We can't, so it'll be more of a reflective case study. But I like to always leave trainings with the opportunity to kind of put what we've talked about into practice, right? So we've talked about a lot today. We talked about why we're here, what the issue is, how big of an issue it is, both nationally here in Minnesota. And we talked about, what's leading into it, the perception of risk, the social influence, parental unawareness. So we talked about kind of some of those issues and why it's a big deal, the psychological risks, the financial risks. And then we interjected a few things that you all can do, whether you're a teacher, social worker, therapist, or your mom and dad, whichever boat you might capture. So putting those puzzle pieces together is always, it's just walking through it. So let's talk about Zach. Zach is a 16-year-old sophomore who has quietly racked up over $10,000 in debt through online sports gambling, primarily by playing daily fantasy football. Now, this is already legal in Minnesota. So this is a real life example because daily fantasy is something that is legal here in Minnesota. Once outgoing and involved in school, athletics, Zach has become increasingly withdrawn, irritable, and secretive, often checking scores during class and skipping assignments to research matchups. His friends report that he talks constantly about odds, player stats, and then making it all back this weekend. He insists that he doesn't have a problem and believes that one big fix or one big win is going to fix everything. So, Zach here, very prototypical of who we talked about were most at risk. Young man or male identifying student here who is engaging in online sports gambling, a legal method here in Minnesota. And it's impacting him. He is becoming, more socially withdrawn, irritable. It's affecting his mental health, one might say. His academics are suffering. And yet he also doesn't think this is a very big deal. And he's already bought into that trap of, well, I just need to win one. I might be down, but I'm only down until I'm up. I just need that one big win. And so when you think about how you, whatever role you play, might engage Zach and hopefully ultimately his parents. I get you might not be able to, depending on your work environment and situation. But if you're able to, how you might engage Zach directly and then his parents. And so this is usually the time in the training where I kind of ask you to weigh in on this. And yeah, not really able to today to do that. So I'll kind of walk through it here and kind of use some of the tools that we've introduced. And so one, we're not going to shame Zach. We're not going to go at him and say, "What are you doing? You're an idiot. Don't you know that? Don't you know better?" But we're going to engage with him and ask him, what's going on, how he got here, what does he need, and you're going to have open that dialogue and conversation with him, and then you might be able to introduce some of the consequences. Zach, it sounded like this started out as a game for you and it probably brought you some joy and you had some fun with it, but it doesn't sound like it's much fun anymore, right? It sounds like this is kind of getting out of hand. And so maybe we should connect you with somebody who might be able to help with that. And so in Zach's situation, it might be, the Minnesota Association on Problem Gambling, or it might be mom and dad. Hey, Zach, does mom and dad know what's going on? Oh, they don't? Well, do you think we could call and bring them in and just kind of catch them up to speed with this? Because, I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned that this pattern is not sustainable, that you're $10,000 in debt today, and what is tomorrow going to bring? And so we got to get some people who care about you involved with this. And if everything works perfectly, mom and dad come in and save the day. We know everything doesn't work perfectly, but it's all about making that effort and hopefully taking this opportunity to educate Zach that, yeah, it can often be fun, but fun and games can turn without some guardrails into a pretty serious problem. And I would say $10,000 in debt is a pretty serious problem for a 16-year-old. So, yeah, educating mom and dad, just engage in that conversation, normalizing, like not normalizing being $10,000 in debt. Don't normalize that, but normalize the activity that engaging in these things is part of your culture. It's something socially that you do, but that there are consequences and you're experiencing them now. So let's get you some help. So that would be one. The second one, we don't have time to do because I want to leave it open for some questions and plug what's coming up down the pipe here for MACMA. But Carl is that kind of tricky one where Carl isn't gambling on sports. Carl is gambling on cryptocurrency. And maybe Carl is even using like eTrade.com or a bank for that matter. It's not a casino that he's doing this through. It's through a legitimate bank or online banking app, and he's making these day trades. And there's no real difference in this, right? The difference is, I guess, to some degree that it's more socially acceptable, that it could be under the guise of investing. No one's going to confuse betting on, the football games this weekend as investing, but we have, from a societal standpoint, thought about these day trading and the stock market as being an acceptable form and something that is under the guise of investing. And so having again conversations with Carl, I think there needs to be some guardrails from an advocacy standpoint on this as well. The predictive markets, the cryptocurrency trading. I don't know how you can regulate the stock market. It drives everything in this country, but I do think there should be some more education, financial literacy around this, no different than we would with gambling. So before I open it up for questions here, I do want to plug, right? So MACMA has been going through a pretty significant transition over the past 6 months. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but as a board member and in full transparency, I mean, MACMA has had a rough go of it lately, and I'm very confident Lauren and her team, great group of people, are getting it back on track and getting us to where who we are and where we're going into the future. And a big part of that, a big part of that is its professional development. If you're like me, you found MACMA through professional development. I got involved with MACMA 15 years ago by doing trainings with them and going to their trainings. That's what MACMA was. It's a foundational part of who they are. And their staff are making a very intentional effort over this year to really kind of come back to that and really give clinicians and, children's mental health specialists and professionals across Minnesota, the training they need to better do their job. And it would mean a lot to me and the association if you could continue to support them through these trainings. And so the plan currently is that every month there is going to be live webinars that you can participate in on a variety of topics. And so, engaging in these is a great way for you to support the organization, but you also get to earn your CEUs and you get to learn from literal experts on a variety of topics. And so I would just encourage you to, keep track of what's coming up. And even if you can't make Thursday, February 5th, if you can't make it because you have something else, a dentist appointment, don't worry. All of these trainings are going to be on demand. No different than the one that I'm doing right now will be on demand later. So you can always catch up on what is missed. And there's going to be more trainings than just the live ones. So I guess it's a plug for me to say, pay attention to the training series and with the professional development MACMA's putting out because there's some really great things happening this year. And it's been a privilege to be kind of the kickoff for that here in January. But next month, we have Sam coming in talking about treating OCD in children and adolescents. Talk about an expert coming in to talk about this. It's going to be fantastic next month. And as I mentioned in my training in March, you all get the privilege to hear from a good friend of mine, Zach Hansen, faculty member up at Hazleton Betty Ford. We were in the Mankato doc program together. And so Zach's a good buddy of mine, and he knows what he's talking about when it comes to this. And he's from Hazleton, one of the leaders in treating addiction. So put it on your calendar, get registered now for these. I think they're going to be quite a treat. So we have about 5 minutes left for those who want to stick around. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. If you have a specific question that you wanted to dump in there, I would take some time to answer that. If you have a question that you'd like to talk offline or connect with me in another way, I'd invite you just to send me an email. And I want to plug as well, if you want today's presentation, that all you got to do is send me an email and I'll be happy to share that with you. So yeah, I guess I'll just take this opportunity to kind of sit back and answer any questions that come in. And for those who don't have any, I guess this is the end of our time together. And I thank you for spending it with me. All right. Oh, we got a thank you. Yeah, absolutely. You're very welcome. You're my first presentation of the year too. So it was kind of had some butterflies. I do a lot of presentations around the country and the state, and this is the first one of 26, and can't think of a better group to do it for. So, all right, Lauren, any closing thoughts from the association or from you? We'll kind of turn it over to you and maybe
Yeah, just
remind them about the CEUs and all that good stuff.
for sure. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Thad, and thank you to everyone for attending and engaging. We will be sending out this recording after the fact, and then we'll send out a certificate as soon as we have those approved CEUs. So reach out if you have any follow-up questions. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us for our first training of 2026. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.